Today, we are looking at comic books and rock and roll. Whoa, 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 easy Rockstar Dante. This isn't the time to make your debut. This is a comic book channel. Oh, come on. Musicians. Hey comic book rock stars, this is Dante D and welcome to the channel where we talk about comic books and other geek stuff. If you're new to the channel today, welcome, welcome. Please consider subscribing, hitting that like button, and check out the channel for other great videos on topics related to geek culture. Also, please do not forget to follow the channel on Twitter and Instagram. I'm sure you're noticing that Instagram is new this week. Last week I think I just had Twitter. Now I have Instagram. What will be next? Facebook? Nah. And speaking of rock and roll, I want everybody to go out and check this new band called Scratch. They are a pop punk band based out of Germany. One of their members, Miles, is a subscriber to the channel, and he sent me a link to some of their songs from their upcoming album. When I went to go check out their stuff, I really liked it. I'm really excited for their upcoming album. So as mentioned earlier, today we were talking about comic books and rock and roll, but specifically Rockstar artists. We've all heard the term before, but what exactly does it mean to be a rockstar artist in the comic book industry? Well, the short answer of it is popularity. However, we really need to unpack that a little bit more to really understand what makes a comic book artist popular to begin with. I have to say, many times throughout the history of the comic book industry, comic book art became a little bit formulaic in order to appeal to the tastes of audiences during a particular time. For example, in the 90s, big muscles, big guns, and tons of accessories were very common. And probably during the 90s, publishers were telling their artists, draw like Jim Lee or draw like Todd McFarlane, because those were two really high-profile artists. But when publishers were taking so much control, that really restricted artists' creative freedom and made comic books all kind of have a very similar look. So when a particular artist rose above and started producing work that was new and different, and they became popular for it, that is when a rock star was born. I mean, putting new stuff out there that was different from what was being produced during a particular period could be seen as rebellious, but what one considers rebellious, another would consider revolutionary. So let's get into our discussion on the top rock star artists in the comic book industry. I have to say these artists are in no particular order. I'm just going to provide you a list of some people that I thought are considered rock stars. So the first artist that I would like to talk about today is a modern artist. His name is Jock, real name Mark Simpson, who is a Scottish artist. You probably know him very well for this Detective Comics cover, which is a modern classic. This artist here has a very unique style. It's so beautifully kind of abstract. Like, I just can't get over how cool this Joker cover is. I just absolutely love it. Jock is an artist that got his start with Andy Diggle in The Loser, and he's also known for doing works such as Green Arrow Year One. Our next rockstar artist on this list is another modern artist. His name is Francesco Francavilla. He's an Italian artist, and you probably remember some of his work from Detective Comics. He and Jock both collaborated with Scott Snyder on that legendary run in Detective Comics. It was one of the last runs of Detective Comics, Volume 1. Francavilla is also known for his work on Black Panther, The Black Beetle, and The Afterlife with Archie. If you haven't read The Afterlife with Archie, I really suggest you do. I feel that his art really complements that old school horror theme that they're going for in Afterlife with Archie, and it's just really awesome. You have to check it out. I feel that Francavilla is a rock star just because of the style that he kind of fostered in his art. He's known as being a pulp-inspired artist. A lot of the art he produces, people have compared to classic covers to pulp magazines. I actually think a lot of his covers look a lot like the art that was on a lot of classic 60s Italian movie posters. I don't know if you've ever seen any of Fellini's movie posters, promotional movie posters from the time. Very similar in art style, and I feel that they look just awesome even in today's modern age. Andrea Sorrentino, another Italian artist on the list. For those of you that are wondering, his name is Andrea. It's not Andrea. In Italy, actually, Andrea is solely a man's name, and it's actually a variant of our Andrew. But anyway, I feel that Sorrentino is probably one of the most underrated artists on this list. I'm really surprised that he hasn't done more. I think he first came on to the comic scene back in 2011 with DC's New 52. I fondly remember his work on I, Vampire, which if you haven't checked it out, it's an amazing, amazing comic run with Sorrentino, and I believe it was Joshua Hale Filyakov. Just amazing. Unfortunately, it only ran about 19 or 20 issues and they canceled it, but it was great. I was really excited to see what was going to come next, but unfortunately they canceled it. Since then, Sorrentino has collaborated with Jeff Lemire on The Green Arrow, and after that Green Arrow run, Sorrentino continued to collaborate with Jeff Lemire on Old Man Logan. His art is just so raunchy and dark and gritty, and I just absolutely love it, and it looks beautiful on a page. Next up is a modern rock star, and you probably have already guessed who it is. This is Greg Capullo. Capullo has been around since the 1990s, but he never really got that status as being a rock star artist in the 1990s. Today, though, he is considered to be a really high-profile rock star artist. He's had great runs on X-Force in the 90s, Spawn, but it was when he did that legendary run on Batman with Scott Snyder that people really started paying attention to his work and really started appreciating it for how awesome it really was. Now, I'm sure when you clicked on this video and you saw Rockstar Artist, you were thinking of those particular 7 artists that founded Image Comics that were actually named Rockstar Artists in the early 1990s. Don't worry, have not forgotten about them. They are definitely on this list, and that brings us to our first classic rockstar artist from the early 1990s, who is Jim Valentino. He is one of the original founders of Image Comics. He rose to prominence at Marvel Comics, and he was really well known for his work on Guardians of the Galaxy. After he left Marvel, he really became known for his work with Image on Shadowhawk. Next up, we have an artist who is super, super controversial, and I'm sure I'm going to regret putting this guy on this list, but you can't do a video about rockstar artists without mentioning Rob Liefeld. I initially was going to include Rob Liefeld at the beginning of the list just to kind of get him out of the way, but I thought if I put him at the beginning, I would probably scare people away. Now, of course, with Rob Liefeld, people either love him or hate him. I did a whole video on him. If you haven't seen it, the link is in the description. But Rob Liefeld, he really needed to be in this list. Whether you like him or you hate him, just bear with me here. Rob Liefeld is such a controversial artist because he became super, super popular, but didn't really have as much talent as a lot of his contemporaries like Jim Lee or Todd McFarlane. I personally don't mind Liefeld. He has his moments. I think some of his work is better than some of his other work, and I like a lot of his earlier stuff. But just the fact that he's so controversial and the mere mention of his name will either make someone really happy or really angry renders someone a rock star. Rock stars are all controversial. If we talk about Rob Liefeld in rock and roll terms, I've heard him compared to someone like Nickelback, and I think that's a pretty fair comparison. I mean, Nickelback is one of the most hated bands of all time. Rob Liefeld, unfortunately, is one of the most hated artists of all time. But at the end of the day, both Rob Liefeld and Nickelback were extremely successful in what they did. And of course, we know Rob Liefeld is known for his work on DC's Hawk and Dove, X-Force, The New Mutants, and Youngblood. Next up, we have Alex Ross, who I've never really heard him referred to as a comic book rock star in the past, but I really think that this guy is a comic book rock star. His art is just absolutely gorgeous. All his work is hand-painted. Alex Ross is known for his work on Marvel's and Kingdom Come. Those are probably 2 of his biggest works. This artist here has been compared in the past to Norman Rockwell meets George Perez, which I think is pretty accurate. His stuff is just stunning and jaw-dropping, and if you don't have anything of Alex Ross's in your collection, I really suggest you take a look at some of his stuff and add him to your collection. It's really a must-have. This guy's going to be remembered forever as being one of the top comic book artists in the industry. And that, in my book, makes him a rock star. Marc Silvestri. This is another one of the artists who were one of the founders of Image Comics. I don't really actually know a lot about Marc Silvestri. I haven't really read a lot of his stuff, But again, a list of Rockstar artists is not complete without Marc Silvestri. Silvestri is known for his work on the Uncanny X-Men, Witchblade, and The Darkness. Erik Larsen, another one of those founders of Image Comics and one of the 1990s Rockstar artists. He rose to prominence with Marvel Comics and really made a name for himself working on The Amazing Spider-Man. Later on, his success continued on his work with Savage Dragon, which was published by Image Comics. Next up is another founder of Image Comics, that is Whilce Portacio. One of my favorites actually on this list. I really like Whilce Portacio's stuff. He really became known for his work on Uncanny X-Men, The Punisher, and X-Force. He is also credited with co-creating the character Bishop with Jim Lee. This guy was huge in the 1990s. And with all of that prominence that he gained, he left Marvel with the other guys and established Image Comics. Jay Lee, this is a Korean artist. He got his start in the early 90s, I believe it was in 1992, at the height of that comic book craze and comic book speculation and comic book rock stars. His notable works are Namor in the Inhumans, and I absolutely love Jay Lee's art style. I think he's another one of those kind of underrated comic book artists, and I think he's a little bit more popular today than he was back in the early 90s when he got his start. But his art style is very, very unique, kind of similar to Andrea Sorrentino's art style, if you ask me. If you put them side by side, you can definitely see some similarities, maybe in the abstract nature they might have a little bit. I personally really like Jay Lee's work on DC's Batman and Superman comic. I thought the art for that was just great. If you haven't checked out Jay Lee's stuff, I really suggest you do. It's just wonderful. Mike Mignola. Now we are getting into some very, very heavy hitter artists. Mike Mignola was an extraordinarily prolific artist in the 1980s and 1990s. He got his start with Marvel in the early 1980s, inking, I believe it was. He worked on Daredevil, Incredible Hulk, Alpha Flight. He then moved on to DC in 1987, and he started doing a lot of covers for DC Comics. Actually, one of my favorite covers that he produced was this one here. This was from the Death in the Family run, which is that famous Death of Robin story arc. I absolutely love this cover. He has those really dark and gritty covers, which were so popular at that time. He then later moved on to Dark Horse Comics, and he created this whole universe of Dark Horse characters, and he was really well known for his work on Hellboy at Dark Horse Comics. Mike Mignola also worked on Gotham by Gaslight, which was a one-shot Batman story, which is a fabulous Batman story. I believe this is the one that involves Jack the Ripper. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but just such amazing art. It's really that grittiness and that darkness, which was relatively new in comics during the 1980s and 90s, that really made Mignola one of those rock stars, I think. Next up, we have another comics heavy hitter from the 80s and 90s. That would be George Perez, who's best known for his work on the New Teen Titans, Infinity Gauntlet, and Crisis on Infinite Earths, which were all great works. Wasn't a huge fan of Crisis on Infinite Earths, but the others I absolutely loved. He really became known for his smooth panel transitions, as well as his attention to detail and those massive group shots. Now, of course, all that detail and those huge group shots do have their limitations as well. I kind of find that art style to be a little clunky at times and just really, really busy and so much to look at. It's just way too much stimulation. I prefer simplicity, but I mean, there are a lot of people out there that do prefer that attention to detail, and that makes George Perez one of the greats and one of the best comic book rock stars. Jim Lee, the artist that the term comic book rock star, I believe, was created for. He's one of the founders of Image Comics. He rose to prominence with Marvel Comics with his work on the Uncanny X-Men and the own self-titled X-Men series. Once Jim Lee founded Image Comics along with some other fellow high-profile artists, he became known for his work on Wildcats and Deathblow, just to name a few titles. When one mentions comic book rockstar, I really think people will think of Jim Lee first. He was just such a prolific artist in the 80s and 90s. And I really think Jim Lee was responsible for creating that 90s comic book character archetype with the big muscles and the guns and the anger. Whether you like that archetype or not, those types of characters were extremely popular in the late 80s and the early 90s, and they brought Jim Lee and a lot of other artists a lot of success. Next up, we have Todd McFarlane, another one of those founders of Image Comics and a very, very high-profile Rockstar artist from the late 1980s and the early 1990s. Todd McFarlane rose to that Rockstar status in the late 1980s with his work on Amazing Spider-Man and those huge in-your-face pinups that he did of Spider-Man and other prominent characters. Todd McFarlane's success continued when he moved on to Image Comics and created Spawn, which is arguably one of the most successful books that Image Comics has ever produced. Frank Miller. No Rockstar list can be complete without Frank Miller. Even though Frank Miller is not commonly referred to as a rockstar, he really is a rockstar. He got his start at Marvel Comics working on Daredevil, and he was an immediate success. People absolutely loved his work on Daredevil. He then later moved on to DC Comics after producing some other great books for Marvel, like that legendary run on Wolverine, the Frank Miller Wolverine. At DC Comics, Frank Miller redefined the comic book industry for the new age with his watershed book, The Dark Knight Returns, which came out in 1986. Like I said, this book here redefined the comics genre and started a quote-unquote new trend in comics, to use EC Comics' term on their Tales from the Crypt comics. But he really did start a new trend in comics where stories were no longer really kind of marketed and geared towards children. I mean, in the early 1980s, comic books were starting to get a little bit more mature, but Frank Miller was really the one with his work who said comic books are no longer for children. His story was so dark and so gritty and so sophisticated. Now, of course, the fan response that Miller got from The Dark Knight Returns was absolutely amazing. However, that wasn't necessarily the case with other people that worked in the comic book industry. Frank Miller even says he got calls from other people who have worked on Batman in the past and basically said that he ruined the character.
Closest thing to a bar fight anybody could have asked for, and that it was quite controversial. That I actually got called up by former Batman writers saying I had ruined their character.
Neal Adams, another comic book heavy hitter. I know a lot of people that actually don't like Neal Adams, but one really can't ignore the unique and revolutionary contributions that he made to the comic book industry in the 1970s. Aside from being an amazing artist and producing some of the best covers of the 1970s, Neal Adams was also a little bit of a social crusader. You really start to see in the 1970s that through his comic book covers and some of his comic book artwork, he tried to enact social change. One of the best examples of this was Neal Adams' work on Green Lantern and Green Arrow, which is a comic book series that became known for its social commentary. Although the series is remembered as being one of the great series of the 1970s, the title was ultimately canceled. It kind of seemed like the public wasn't really ready for social relevance in their comics yet. There's actually a story of Neal Adams passing by Julius Schwartz, the then editor of DC Comics, in the halls, and he says, "Hey, how's Relevance doing?" And Julius Schwartz said, "Relevance is dead." But I think the fact that Neal Adams was socially conscious when he was producing his work makes him a rock star, because I mean, we all know that rock stars are known a lot of times for trying to enact social change through their work, or at least try to call attention to problems in society through their work. And last on our list is not only my favorite artist, but also the artist that I consider to be the biggest rock star in comic books, and that is Jim Steranko. Jim Steranko really doesn't need any introduction. He's known for his fabulous work on Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. He had an amazing Incredible Hulk cover. He was a very, very prolific artist during the Silver Age, and he rose in popularity through the unique work that he was producing. Steranko is known for incorporating various different types of art styles in his own work. he said it himself on many occasions that he incorporated expressionism in his work. He incorporated pop art, surrealism. He toyed with different art styles, and he really became popular for it. Steranko is considered to be one of those first artists that assisted with that shift of the comics medium, originally being for children, and then moving on to being a little bit more adult-oriented. From watching various documentaries and reading a little bit about Steranko, I was able to find out that Steranko's work really garnered a lot of attention more from college students rather than from children. Jim Steranko effectively captured the zeitgeist at the time and incorporated it into his work, and that really allowed him to rise to prominence and be this rock star. He's actually often considered to be the Jimi Hendrix of comics. They're not only contemporaries, but the type of work that they were both producing was just really revolutionary and really cool. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on Steranko because, to be honest with you, in doing research for this video, I found so much information about Jim Steranko, so much cool. Like, this guy is like super cool. So in coming weeks, I'm going to post a video that is dedicated to the comic book medium's #1 rock star, and to me anyway, and that is Jim Steranko. Do you agree with this list? Are there some artists that I didn't include on this list that you really feel are rock stars and should have been in here? Let me know in the comments and why you think a particular artist is a rock star and should have been in this list. Until next time, this is Dante D signing off. Ciao.